and a privilege to be able to wrap policy around it as policymakers to make this a successful venture. So with that, Mr Speaker, I commend this bill to the House.
Dr Megan Woods.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and it is my pleasure to take a call on this bill as well and to reiterate that Labor supports this bill and to also extend our congratulations that my colleague, the Honourable David Parker, outlined in his earlier contribution on this debate. Our congratulations to Rocket Lab and to Peter Beck for what is a significant advance for New Zealand. This is New Zealand joins a list of only a few countries, 10 in fact around the world, that have reached into space. And this is not something that is insignificant, and it is something that we need to celebrate, Mr Speaker. While we've heard rightly a number of celebrations and politicians jumping on the bandwagon or the rocket wagon in order to try and achieve some of the associated fame with New Zealand's launch into the far reaches of space. And we've had the Minister Stephen Joyce, who has been a key proponent of this, who is purported to be New Zealand and New Zealand Parliament's own rocket man. But, Mr Speaker, I would like to pay homage to where it indeed needs to lie. And that is to go back to the last Labor-led government, Mr Speaker, and the Minister of Economic Development in that government, the Honourable Trevor Mallard, who was one of the ministers who had great foresight to back this project at the very beginning. And I think, Mr Speaker, as Labor's Science and Innovation Research and Development spokesperson, it is important here to underscore the need to be investing in the types of science that are going to take this long to see fruition. That it was back in 2007 when the Honourable Trevor Mallard attended the launch of Rocket Lab's launch and said it would enhance New Zealand's emerging reputation as a developer of first-rate technology and components. And that is the kind of timescale that we are looking at in terms of the commercialisation of some of this research. And actually, in many ways, Mr Speaker, this is a very short timescale for commercialisation such as this. And we always need to bear that in mind and make sure that we are doing as the last Labor government did, having the foresight to invest in research and development where we are going to see the long-term gains for the country. Because good things take time, Mr Speaker. So now that we've got the congratulations in order, it is important to look at what this bill does. And this bill is in many ways a very open piece of legislation that sets up a framework around which this activity in New Zealand can be regulated. So it facilitates the development of a space industry and its safe and secure operation. It implements certain international obligations New Zealand has relating to space activities and space technologies. And I think one of the interesting things about this legislation is that it puts into our legislative books in a very clear way international obligations that go back to 1968. That the bill puts into legislation obligations that New Zealand picked up from its ratification in 1968 of the Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies and outer space treaties. So, Mr Speaker, that goes back to just after the time that humans first stepped foot on the Moon, and how long and how far we have come under that. One of the issues that has, of course, risen since the ratification of that treaty and where we are here in 2017 is to what uses humans are going to put outer space to use. And that is something that the Select Committee did hear when it heard the submissions on this legislation. For what purposes would people being put into space? And there was a submission that it should be explicitly contained in the legislation that this was only to be for peaceful purposes. But, Mr Speaker, some of those international treaties that we signed right back there really did put in place the fact that it was need and that was the purpose. And the advice that the committee received is that didn't need to be explicitly outlined in this legislation because it was inherent in our international obligations. So if we have a look at the Outer Space Treaty, the nations that did sign that treaty agreed not to place an orbit around the Earth any objects carrying nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction, install such weapons on celestial bodies or station such weapons in outer space in any other manner, to establish military bases, installations or fortifications on celestial bodies, and to test any weapons or conduct manoeuvres on celestial bodies. And these are important things that we need to understand why it is that we're putting in place this regime. The other thing that the legislation had to consider carefully was managing New Zealand's liability that arise from its obligation as a launching state. That actually launching things through airspace to the levels that reach the outer space limits that are defined in this legislation or allowed for in this legislation, I'll return to some of the definitions when we get to the committee stages of this legislation, do carry with it risks. That we've seen in our airspace discussion of risks at a much lower level around how it is we're going to regulate the use of drones in this country, or likewise how it is that we're going to control for safety in these other limits. We do this around airspace in terms of our aviation levels, but what are the safeguards that need to be put in place when we come to the outer space as well? So that goes on the need to establish a system to control certain high-altitude activities that take place from New Zealand, and then also preserve New Zealand's national security and national interests. So these are things that needed to be put into place. But, Mr Speaker, this is the very dry parts of what the bill does. But what the bill also speaks to is the kind of country that we can be. It's the kind of country that does invest in research and development. It's the kind of country that does believe in innovation. And that's the kind of government that Labor governments have always been. We saw that with their backing this project right in the beginning, right back in the early 2000s, that we're seeing the fruition now. And we're going to see it again in future decades, Mr Speaker, through the fact that we also need to be planning for how it is that we have a workforce and an economy that is ready for this kind of high-tech future, and that make sure that we have New Zealanders that have the skills that can take advantage of the economic development opportunities that can arise from this. We've already seen that we have seen some very nimble organisations in New Zealand take advantage. The Awaroa Space Station down by Invercargill, where we saw Venture Southland approach the European Space Agency when they needed a southern launch zone and pitch our part of the world. We have obvious strategic advantages in terms of being on the other side of the globe and what we can offer. But we also have niche opportunities in the value chain that exists around space exploration. And this legislation does set up a licensing and permitting regime that will control those activities. But all that will count for nothing, Mr Speaker, if we can't offer young New Zealanders who are excited at watching New Zealand enter into being one of the 10 countries that had launched a rocket, who rightly felt excited at that moment, if we're not giving them the kind of skills and education that they need to be equipped for the future. And Mr Speaker, we don't know exactly what that future is going to look like. I think when we see the treaty that we entered into in 1968 that talks about setting up military bases on celestial bodies, that's not what we're grappling with in this legislation. So, Mr Speaker, what we have to do is make sure that we are building an education system and a training and skills system that does equip people for that future. And that is exactly the kind of fresh thinking that Labor has been doing through its Future of Work Commission. We know that of new entrants entering primary school now, that 65% of them are going to undertake a job that doesn't exist today. And some of those could well be in these kind of industries, Mr Speaker. So we also, as well as putting in place these kind of regimes to control and regulate and make sure we are operating safely, our space industry, we also have to be thinking more broadly about how it is we as a country prepare for this future. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Joe Goodhue.
Speaker, well, it gives me